Some of the most important safety rules we have today, they weren't dreamed up in some boardroom. They were written in lead-lined coffins. And today, we're going to dig into the harrowing stories of the people whose deaths, as tragic as they were, forced us to finally understand the terrifying power we were playing with and create the safeguards we now kind of take for granted.
There's this one detail that just keeps popping up in these stories, and it's absolutely chilling. It's a sudden, silent, eerie blue flash. Now, this isn't fire. It's something way more sinister. It's the signature look of what's called Cherenkov radiation, a sign that a nuclear chain reaction has just gone wild. And for anyone who sees it up close, well, it's already too late.
So, what is actually happening in that blue flash? It's a state called criticality. And the easiest way to think about it is like a tipping point. You have a lump of radioactive material, like plutonium or uranium, and it goes from being a pretty stable piece of metal to suddenly sustaining its own nuclear chain reaction. It basically becomes a tiny, uncontrolled star, unleashing this catastrophic burst of radiation. Understanding that one idea, criticality, is absolutely key to all the stories we're about to tell.
Okay, so our first story takes us to Los Alamos, right after World War II. And it's all about one single, kind of cursed object, a 14-pound sphere of plutonium that scientists would eventually nickname the Demon Core. The experiments they did on it, they called it tickling the dragon's tail. And trust me, it was every bit as dangerous as it sounds.
Think about this. In less than 1 year, this one single piece of plutonium killed 2 brilliant young physicists. First up was Harry Daghlian, who was working late all by himself. Then, just a few months later, it was Louis Slotin, who was demonstrating a really risky procedure to his colleagues. 2 different guys, 2 different days, but the exact same deadly object.
And the details of what happened are just eerily similar. In both accidents, it was a simple, totally human error, a dropped brick for one, a slipped screwdriver for the other, that set everything off. And in both cases, the physicists' first instinct was, well, it was heroic. They used their own bare hands to stop the reaction, saving their colleagues in the room, but in doing so, guaranteeing their own horrible, agonizing deaths.
The deaths of Daghlian and Slotin served as a brutal, brutal wake-up call. Their sacrifice led to immediate, and fundamental changes. No more working alone on these kinds of experiments. The 2-person rule was born. No more using a screwdriver to hold back a nuclear reaction. From then on, all this work would be done with remote-controlled machines. And the Demon Core itself? They melted it down. Its deadly career was finally over.
But look, these dangers weren't just for top-secret labs and famous physicists. The lessons learned at Los Alamos were sadly very slow to trickle down to other places. Our next stories show you what happens when just routine, everyday work, a bit of complacency, and some bad design all collide and turn a normal workplace into a death trap. So let's jump to 1999. A technician named Hisashi Ochi and his coworkers were rushing to meet a deadline, and to save time, they started skipping safety steps. They were mixing a uranium solution in, of all things, a simple steel bucket instead of the proper equipment, and they used 7 times the approved amount. As they poured, there it was, that blue flash. They had created a criticality accident with their bare hands.
Uchi, who was standing just 2 feet away from that bucket, absorbed a dose of radiation that is, well, it's almost impossible to even comprehend. 17 sieverts. Now, a sievert is the unit we use to measure the biological damage from radiation, and the dose Uchi got is believed to be the highest dose any human has ever been exposed to in a single moment.
To put that number into perspective for you, just look at this. 5 sieverts is considered a lethal dose. It's fatal for about half the people who get it. Ochi received more than 3 times that. The radiation literally shredded his DNA. It just stopped his body's ability to create any new cells. He died after 83 horrific days in the hospital.
And decades before that, a really similar tragedy happened to a chemical operator named Cecil Kelly, also at Los Alamos. He flipped a switch to turn on a mixer for a big tank of plutonium solution, a job he'd probably done 1,000 times before. But what he didn't know was that a design flaw had let the plutonium settle into a super concentrated, critical layer at the bottom. The second those mixer blades churned it, blue flash. Kelly was dead just 5 hours later.
These weren't just personal tragedies. They were total systemic failures. And they forced massive change. Uchi's death led to a complete overhaul of Japan's nuclear regulations. And Kelly's death?
It inspired this brilliant engineering solution called fail-safe geometry, which is basically designing containers and shapes that make it physically impossible to go critical no matter how much human error is involved.
So, up to this point, we've been talking about accidents. But the really unique properties of radiation have also made it a tool for something way more deliberate. Everything from medical quackery to, you guessed it, state-sponsored assassination.
Okay, this number, 1,400, that's the estimated number of bottles of a product called Radiathor that a wealthy American industrialist named Eben Byers drank back in the late 1920s. Radiathor was basically just bottled water with radium dissolved in it, and it was sold as a miracle cure for, well, everything. And Byers? He was a true believer.
And this blunt, just shocking headline from the Wall Street Journal tells you exactly how that story ended. Byers' body had absorbed all that radium into his bones, and they literally disintegrated from the inside out. His horrifying death led directly to the creation of the modern FDA and gave it the power to regulate medical products.
Now let's fast forward to the 21st century, where we see a much more sinister use of radiation. In 2006, Alexander Litvinenko, a critic of the Russian government, met a couple of agents for tea in London. They slipped a tiny, totally invisible dose of polonium-210 into his cup. And it's really the perfect assassin's tool. It emits alpha particles that are incredibly deadly inside the body, but you can't detect them with standard radiation equipment. It caused this slow, agonizing death that completely baffled doctors until it was far, far too late.
But not all these stories are about accidents or malice. Some are about profound, unbelievable courage. Our final story is one of calculated, willing sacrifice to prevent an unimaginable disaster. Let's talk about the Soviet submarine K-19.
So in 1961, deep in the North Atlantic, the K-19 suffered a critical coolant leak in its reactor. It had no backup system, so a meltdown was coming, and it was coming fast. Now, a meltdown on a nuclear-armed sub near a NATO base, that could have easily been mistaken for a first strike, potentially kicking off World War III. The only solution was for someone to go in there and fix it by hand. 22 men volunteered to enter the reactor compartment in shifts, knowing it was a suicide mission.
The price for their heroism was absolute. As you can see here, not a single one of the 22 volunteers survived for long. They saved their submarine, and they very likely saved the world, but in the process, they absorbed so much radiation that their own bodies became hazardous waste. They had to be buried in lead coffins, a final grim testament to their sacrifice.
So, as we pull all these stories together, we start to see this clear, really painful pattern emerge. We often don't innovate safety just because it's a good idea. We react to tragedy. Each of these events, as horrifying as they were, became a cornerstone in building the robust nuclear safety culture that we rely on today.
Yeah, when you lay it all out like this, the pattern is just undeniable. From the improvised labs of Los Alamos to the assembly lines in Japan, tragedy forced innovation. The lesson from Daghlian and Slotin was, hey, let's take the human hand out of the equation. The lesson from Eben Byers was that claims need proof. And the lesson from the K-19 crew was that the human cost of failure is just immeasurable. Every single lesson was paid for in blood.
And that leaves us with a really critical question to think about. We've built this entire architecture of safety on the memory of these individuals. So as we push the boundaries of new technologies today, think about AI, genetic engineering, space exploration, it's worth asking ourselves, are we actually learning the lessons from history, or are we just waiting for new tragedies to write the safety manuals of the future?